Good evening and or morning/afternoon, depending on where you are at in the world. Today is Friday, the 3rd of April, 2020. I'm Brach Jennings.
And I'm Peter Clark.
And this is another edition of Stumbling Block during the times of COVID-19. And today we have yet another very special guest whom Peter will now introduce to us.
That's right. We have with us Pastor Kristen Van Stee. She is assistant to the Bishop in Nebraska and the manager for candidacy in Region 4 of the ELCA. This is our first guest from Southern Seminary. So we want to make sure that Kristen wanted to make sure we put this up front, that she does not, on this podcast, represent the Nebraska Synod nor ELCA churchwide. Her opinions are her own, standard boilerplate, yada, yada.
Thank you. Yes, I appreciate that. But it's wonderful to be here with all of you. And I very much look forward to the conversation.
Yes, thank you for joining us, Kristen. And it's lovely to have our first guest from Southern Lutheran, let's be clear, Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary, now of Lenore-Rhine University, but not when Kristen was a student there. And right. Our first guest who is in an administrative capacity in the ELCA. So we are delighted.
Yes. And it's surprising to me to find myself in that position as well, actually. But it's something I really enjoy doing. It's a joy to find ministry in unexpected ways and places. So yeah, and I'm happy to chat with you guys. I was just saying I really enjoyed the episode you guys just did on virtual communion. Mm-hmm. So I listened to most of that, and I was very intrigued to hear you guys debate Lutheran confessions back and forth. It was a great conversation, I thought.
Well, thank you. I think, Peter, I don't know if you agree with this, but that might end up being one of our more popular and or controversial episodes.
It's on its way to it. It's up there with getting up there with our Just War episode for most listens.
Ah, yeah. Well, clearly virtual communion is the hot topic right now.
It absolutely is. I just shared an article on my Facebook about it. I'm still vacillating back and forth. Like, I still haven't come down in a position on it. I know that nationally, they've recommended sort of a fast from it. And I've heard some good arguments on that side. And I've heard some good arguments for maintaining community and things like that. Kristen, what are your thoughts on it?
Well, yeah, again, I think what I appreciate about you guys was that there's value in the debate. Mm-hmm. And I didn't feel like it was meant to be a recommendation, so let's do this. It's more just let's workshop it. And I think that is a value, and we should be doing that with all kinds of issues. And so I appreciate, the hypothetical, the speculative, but I think when it actually comes down to practice, that's where I'm much more cautious, conservative. Mm-hmm. And we may get into this later. My absolute favorite topic is church history. And so I tend to think through that lens for a lot of things. And there's just so many ways that decisions on practice can have huge unintended consequences. So I would err on the side of being cautious and saying, fasting from communion is I think a good choice, because innovation, novelty could have some really unintended consequences down the line. And there's lots of examples of that, even within our Eucharistic practices today that are common in parishes. And probably the biggest example of that is those little shot glasses that we can't get rid of.
Right. And you shared an article with Brach and I about that, sort of from when those first came about. And, now we're seeing, and this has been interesting too. This is all sort of, it's interesting where people come down when the rubber hits the road. People that I knew that were sort of, we all used to make fun of the, little hermetically sealed, you can get them with you peel off the top and there's a wafer, then you peel the next layer and it's the cup.
Oh yeah, I laughed when I first saw that in a catalog. I was like, what?
And now I know people who are ordering those.
I know. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, from a more cautious point of view, I think I definitely understand the pastoral care need, and that in many ways trumps so many other decisions that we make in the parish. And as a parish pastor, I've made decisions I didn't necessarily think were the best, quote unquote, liturgical practice when it came to like a funeral, because I knew it was so important to minister to that person in that moment. And the Eucharist is, such an important part of, it's not just up for theological debate. This is a really daily lived part of our faith. It binds us together. It's hugely important. I don't want to minimize that. But on the other hand, it's just so easy for anybody to kind of go off on their own tangent, come up with something screwy that then becomes standard, an unintended consequence. There's just a lot of examples of that, of things that were acceptable for a certain context then becoming standard.
Right.
I think that's why I was trying to say in our episode toward the end of it that if there are times in which virtual communion is accepted, I really hope that it's made clear that this is only for this utterly extraordinary circumstance. This is by no means normal practice. And I would hope that if it started becoming normal practice, the bishops would put a stop to it.
Yeah. I mean, personally, I'm quite wary about it myself. On the other hand, there is a difference between, the bishops kind of settled this issue when radio and television first came out. That transmission of communion was really not considered an option. If you go back in those records, they debated it among the bishops at those times. And they kind of settled like, no, you can't celebrate Holy Communion via television, but that was a one-way communication, right. Recognizing the technology is different, but at the same time, I'm also relying on our expert ecumenical, Eucharistic theologians, our expert liturgy professors to really kind of weigh in and really dissect the nuances of what this could mean.
Yeah.
While at the same time recognizing that, what does that mean for Joe and Jane Smith in the pew? So.
Right.
And I don't expect, if I had to guess, that liturgy professors and or historians would support this.
I mean, probably not.
I'm a crazy statistician, so I don't have the same stake in this, right? Because everything's new for me as a systematician. But okay, that's an overstatement. But I wouldn't be surprised. Just think comments that I've seen online from liturgy scholars and from historical scholars about this. It's pretty unanimous against, actually.
Yeah. I haven't heard any of the professors coming out in favor of it. I think it's really I've just been hearing anecdotally around the country of certain pastors trying it out, and they may or may not have the blessing or approval of their bishop. Who knows? So.
Right.
Oh, and that's a whole other question. If the pastor does it, but the bishop doesn't want it done, what does that mean?
I mean, there is that debate in terms of, is the synod the church police? And that's a tough question to answer. I mean, I'm being a little flippant, but I think in terms of polity, our bishops have a great deal of authority. The Council of Bishops has a great deal of authority. So, it would be easier if we were Roman Catholic and we had, that centralized place that made these judgments on things. But we also rely on, bottom up communication between the three expressions of the church. So it's tricky. But I do think our pastors and our congregations, I mean, we're not isolated. We're responsible to one another. And going off on a tangent, while it might seem justified, you're responsible to the church as a whole in how you are practicing the faith and administering the sacraments. I don't know. I see the world in so many shades of gray. It's hard for me to come down with like a blanket statement.
Yeah.
I'll spend the whole day waffling on the issue, because on the one hand I can think of exceptions. Somebody is actively dying, is begging for communion one last time, can't actually go and meet them. Like, we can all come up with those scenarios where we would, as in terms of pastoral care, probably go against our better judgment in terms of normal practice. But again, you said it yourself, Brach, exceptional doesn't necessarily mean that it should become standard. So.
Yeah. And I think as long as it's understood as this is utterly exceptional, then I think it should be, I'm using the word should, sorry. Then I think it's good to think of it as a matter of evangelical freedom at this point.
Right.
Because, as Luther says in the Large Catechism, even if you abuse the sacrament, you cannot destroy it.
Right. And
now, is this an abuse of the Lord's Supper? I think far worse things have been done than occasionally doing digital communion. I think we're all right there. But as long as it's, my fear, Kristen, is, and I think I said this on the last episode, but I'll say it again. My fear is just that there will be a sense among Lutherans that, now we can do this, so let's go do it.
Yeah. You're right. Doing it once
that
can
is what I wouldn't
seem
want
to imply permission. Does it give implicit permission?
Yeah. That's and so I like what the Lutheran Church of Württemberg did, which is the church where I'm currently at. They just said we're not going to have Abendmahl, the German for the Lord's Supper, until after Easter. Period.
Yeah.
And over here, it's communion is only once every 4 weeks anyway, so it's not as big of a deal as it is for the American scene, and so Württemberg just made a lot of sense to me when they said that. And you get the service of the Word, you have the consolation of the Word, and it's really all about the Word anyway. So there we have it. That's another solution, is just to say that we're not gonna do this until after whenever.
Well, and it is, we're living in not just difficult times, but ironic times, because we've spent the last how many decades of the liturgical reform movement trying to teach parishioners, no, we should be doing it more often. This is why. And yet now we've had to walk it back and say, well, now we can't.
Right.
Someone
called this the lentiest Lent that ever lented.
Yep, I've seen that meme, and it is.
I guess for me, I've been in Tübingen now it'll be a year actually on Tuesday, to the day that I moved to Tübingen. So I've gotten used to the once a month communion. It's just not a deal. And it's not, the Lutherans here, they all wear the black robes. They don't wear albs and stoles,
Sure.
And I actually like that a lot better. I'm not going to lie.
You like that 19th century Lutheranism.
Well, I don't know if it is. I think is it 19th century? I thought it was even in the 16th century the Lutherans were wearing the black robes.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, I'd have to go back and look and see.
Brach wants his preaching flags.
What?
The little tabs that you wear that hang down when you're preaching.
Yep.
Sure. That's not really. That's not really my praise of the way of Tübingen. But what I like about it is it's centered on the preaching in a way that the American Lutherans and Kristen, I went to 3 ELCA seminaries for my MDiv and then 2 Master of Theology degrees. So I had 8 years in the ELCA seminaries, and there were times when I thought it has become so Eucharistic that it has lost the notion of the proclaimed word, and the sacrament is actually, although I accept the Luther's notion of the true presence and all of that, but the sacrament is losing the fact that it's actually the embodied visible word again. And so the nice thing about being in Tübingen is they're open to it, and they're open to the fact that the preaching's Lutheran, the worship is Reformed. They just they make no qualms about this. It's a unification of Martin Butzer and Johannes Brems.
Well, and that's an excellent point to mention that the Protestant church in Germany is a unified church. And I was just thinking, I took a trip to Iceland back in 2015. I think they do communion most Sundays. I think it's every Sunday. So I think it may vary in Europe, but I was going to say to your earlier, I was going to say to your earlier point, again, looking at it through the lens of history, I can't help but do that, is there's always these course corrections when the pendulum swings too far one way. Mm-hmm. And it's no surprise that the liturgical reform movement found so much fertile ground in the United States among the Lutherans and Episcopalians who were seeking to recover something they had lost by becoming more melting pot, looking like every other American Protestant worshiping community, and discovering that there was a unique heritage to be restored, and seeking to restore the importance of the sacraments, which had, been pushed to the side almost literally, you only bring out that baptismal font when you actually have a baptism. Otherwise it sits in the corner. So it makes sense to me that these are course corrections when the pendulum swings too far in one direction. I should say something about the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Württemberg is actually a Lutheran church. It's not a union church. They're in the Evangelical Church of Germany, the EKD. There are Lutheran churches, there are Reformed churches, and there are United churches, which are both Lutheran and Reformed. But Württemberg is really an odd duck because it is Lutheran by preaching, but it adopted a more Reformed style of worship, which is you don't have the chasubles and the albs and all of that. I am happy to say where I worship is in the Stiftskirche in Tübingen. It's I don't know how many hundreds of years old, 700 years old or whatever. They have all the music. They just don't have anything else. Oh. they have all the music. They have all the artwork, all that stuff. But none of the vestments or they're just in black robes. Sure.
It's really quite something.
Of course, all of this is you could view it as somewhat esoteric adiaphora, but yes. I tend to resonate with the liturgical reform movement personally. Right. I appreciate recovering that long tradition of things that were seemingly lost.
Sure.
Over the course of immigration, especially.
Well, and that speaks also to our question now, because you're talking about a course correction and a pendulum swing. I'm just describing what's in Tübingen, at least, in depth, just to say that I'm not sure, saying we're not going to have the Lord's Supper until after Easter, I don't know that it would be as big of a shock as for the ELCA. Mm-hmm.
Well, and to be honest, here in Nebraska, we still have some that are once a month, and certainly that was my first call. So they're going to say, what's the big deal? Now they will be concerned about Easter worship. I mean, I think that's the big thing, and that's universal for all Christians, is what a weird, can you have Easter? I mean, the ordinary layperson is probably asking themselves, is it Easter if we don't have our sunrise service where we're all together? Right. How can we not have communion? How can we not have the Easter proclamation? So I'm sure those are the things that are going on in lay people's minds right now.
Well, I think those are going on in more than just lay people's minds.
Right.
Well, so are you in Nebraska? Are you still allowed to have like actual worship, or does it have to all be digital and Zoom and all that?
That's a good question. So, yeah, in terms of the current events with Nebraska, we still do not have an official, as of this date, the 3rd of April, a stay-at-home order. However, they did, over, I think it was a month ago, they did cancel all school, all sports, and worship has been closed, but I don't think it's by official state order. We're still at the 10 people or less gathering. But, you know, the Roman Catholic diocese, there's far more Roman Catholics here in Nebraska than anything else. They were very quick to suspend all mass. For a while, ELCA churches were kind of left to make their own decisions early on when it was just starting to hit on the coasts, and we didn't have any confirmed cases yet. But now I think there's nobody worshiping in person. I think maybe some people are trying to think about the drive-in worship thing, but whether that violates, you know, if you have 12 people in cars, does that violate the order is a legal question. So
okay, I'm sorry, excuse me while I just have a moment here. Drive-in worship, what are we, a movie theater now?
Oh, this is not new. I knew of drive-in churches back when I was in college.
Yeah.
Oh, Lord Jesus.
I'm not endorsing it, please, but there are folks trying to figure out on Sunday, could we have everybody pull up in their cars? They stay in their cars. A short band radio station is hooked up to the pastor's pulpit, and everybody, like a drive-in movie theater, they're sitting in the parking lot and they hear the worship service.
I don't know why, but that bothers me more than digital Lord's Supper ever could. Oh my!
There's a lot that you could dissect there, and I don't know if we want to spend that time doing that. But as of right now, I don't believe anybody is still trying to worship. I think I hear conversations here and there of trying to do, one-on-one pastoral care still in person. You know, trying to figure out funerals and what what can and can't be done. You know, these are things all being decided on local levels by the parish pastor and the community and the councils of the congregations. So yeah, Nebraska is unusual. I think it's as of today, North Dakota, South Dakota, Arkansas, Nebraska were the ones who don't have a stay-at-home order currently.
Yeah.
How's the president's approval rating doing in Nebraska?
I mean, I have not checked that. We are a very red state, socially conservative, politically conservative. Now, certainly not everybody is, but certainly the majority lean that way. But on the other hand, I will say about Nebraskans is they're just eminently practical and have good common sense. And I actually saw, I think it was the New York Times had published the report based on cell phone data of which states are actually abiding by the, less travel, they kind of collected all that cell phone data, and Nebraska was pretty good. I mean, and that's even without the stay at home order. People were just, we should be staying at home. Okay. So in terms of common sense, I think, these Great Plains people are, have a good deal of common sense. So whether or not we should have a stay at home order or not is being hotly debated. I mean, there was an article in the Omaha World Herald this morning on that. Should the governor issue one or not? His pushback has been it's working to have a county by county order. And I will say, not being an expert on any of that, it's just my personal opinion, but the state is kind of, a picture in duality in terms of the metro area versus everywhere else, which is very thinly populated. So, a stay-at-home order is going to be affecting Omaha very differently from a county where most of the villages are only 300 people.
Right.
So,
well, you're lauding the common sense of the people of Nebraska, And we're going to hope they have the common sense not to do drive-in worship. There we go.
They're trying really hard to do. Most people are doing online. They really are.
Yeah.
But I've also something I've been doing is I've been telling a lot of pastors, like, it doesn't have to be high tech, especially if you've got a whole, you've got 50 people and most of them are over 60 and they just can't bring themselves to figure out Zoom. Fair enough. Why can't we just all stay at home with a copy of Suffrages, Responsive Prayer, and just agree to do that at 11 a.m. on Sunday, and trust the Holy Spirit still binds us together as one body of Christ while separated by space and distance and even time.
Oh,
so,
wow. Thank you. I needed to hear that word more than you'll ever know, Kristen. Thank you very much.
Well, and I don't want to
I'm being serious.
I don't want to dismiss the great, work that's being done online. And I am interested to hear, what, in terms of best church practice and in terms of theology of worship comes out of, you can make the argument because it's two-way, and you guys were debating that in a previous podcast. Mm-hmm. When it's not a one-way transmission, when it's actually participatory, it is much more like worship that we're aware of. And I think there's value in that. But I also want pastors to know, please, you in small town Nebraska, don't think that you have to reinvent the wheel or work harder and try and figure out Zoom and how you're going to get everybody on Facebook Live or, why can't it just be a low tech,
It is interesting to look at how this was done before, like in the 1918 influenza pandemic, where we didn't have this technology available to us.
Yeah, we've been here before.
Yeah,
exactly. I sent you that article from Patheos, and they literally just lifted news articles from 1918. That's all they did. So it was just primary source materials, and it was just eerily similar to what it's being talked about right now. And I thought that was interesting about ministers complaining that, worship had been canceled, and yet they walk down the street and see the local pool hall is filled with people. And it's like, yeah. I mean, and Lowe's and Walmart are full of people too.
Right.
So
no, absolutely.
While we canceled worship. So there's some strange parallels between, literally 100 years of experience.
Right. But on the flip side now, as well as then, churches are a main vector for transmission.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you guys see that there was the, I believe it was Assembly of God in Arkansas that worshipped. And they ended up becoming kind of the epicenter of infection in Arkansas.
I did. I saw that on. So I have a saying, Kristen, and it's a little bit heretical, so please forgive me. But I say I can do all things through Amy Goodman on Democracy Now!, who strengthens.
Right.
And if you know something about, if we get to know one another, my theology is quite Christological, but I can't resist that one because let me tell you, Amy Goodman at the moment is my left-hand kingdom lifeline. Oh, man, I hear her now. I've been listening to her for about 4 years now, but I hear her about every day. In the afternoon in Germany, right? Because it's morning in America. But so I heard about it on Democracy Now.
Right.
But you know what? Somebody, it got my sly side going on. This governor of Florida, who gave an exception to churches because they're essential businesses. And so he's allowing, I forget the guy's name, but whoever the governor of Florida is, that's it. He's allowing people to worship in churches because they're essential businesses. He was denying the seriousness of COVID-19. And part of me said, well, Lord, I hope he gets it.
Brach.
Well, I mean...
Well, he has.
Why? But my gosh.
I think as of yesterday, he kind of made a U-turn. So I think maybe they're moving in a different direction. But
okay. Well, there's hope, but
I I don't know if you guys actually read the 1918 accounts, but it's so similar. It was very ad hoc across all these different. There was no centralized federal response for the longest time.
Right.
It was literally local government, state government, but often just municipalities were having to make these decisions. And think about that in a world where it's just newspapers and a telegraph and so imagine trying to face this obstacle of pandemic only without the same level of communication.
Well,
and it's been illustrated by the success of the different cities. Everybody's been sharing that account of Philadelphia versus St. Louis.
Yeah.
The tale of the two cities and their, vastly different responses and how they approached it and the difference it makes. So it's just funny to me that America is America. We've always been more or less decentralized in comparison to other countries. Whether that's the right course of action or not, that's debatable. But I think it's in keeping with, we've been here before. We did this 100 years ago. This was literally how we did it 100 years ago, and we're doing it again. So,
right. It's fascinating to look at and to watch. And I'm in an Irish Americana band, and the St. Louis versus Philadelphia thing is actually one of the reasons that we preemptively canceled all of our St. Patrick's Day shows.
Yeah.
That whole week we were booked solid, and we canceled all of them. And a number of venue owners were very mad at us until it came down that they wouldn't have been able to have their celebration anyway, because all of the gatherings and things in this area got canceled. We were just ahead of the curve in giving them time to prepare for those cancellations.
Yeah.
But my concern about this, and this is relating to, what's the guy's name? DeSantis?
Yeah.
This is related to him. It's become a partisan issue now. This actually was so. All right, Amy Goodman is the first part of my trinity, but I think the New York Times would be the second. I'll find the third part at some point, but the New York Times is the second. So I read there was this choir. It was I don't remember. Yeah, whatever that was in. And they went to practice, and then they all got sick, and so the New York Times story, which, I actually I've stopped following the Times as closely as I did a month ago because it was giving me anxiety attacks.
Of course.
So I had to moderate myself a little bit. But my concern is they had this article, I can't remember when it was, about Democrats and side note, listeners, I'm not making any political endorsements at the moment, but Democrats and Republicans are experiencing different pandemics. And I went, see, now that terrifies me. That absolutely terrifies me.
Well, I mean, we are living in very partisan times, so I should say that first. But I also think, it's what hermeneutic are you looking at the situation? And that's true for anything. And it's just interesting, just talking to ordinary people on the street and how they're interpreting. I have gotten a handful of people in not Lutheran, but you're like, maybe it's the end times, so we'll interpret it through that hermeneutic. Maybe it is a conspiracy, or maybe, so all these different, viewpoints are really influenced on your worldview and how you interpret everything. And so it's really just, I think it's really just a result of probably the failure in communication between people of different hermeneutics, that we're not even having the same conversation, probably.
No, I think you're right.
And related to not even having the same conversation, where are people getting their news from? And just the fact that I have said, so I'm listening to Amy Goodman and I'm reading the New York Times, for many people in the United States, nobody would take me seriously. Merely because of those two news sources.
Right.
Doesn't matter how many awards they've won for journalistic excellence. it doesn't matter that when they make mistakes, what I appreciate about the New York Times in particular, when they make mistakes, they always admit it.
Right.
And none of that seems to matter anymore. And so I've been in Germany for a year, and and maybe I'm getting a skewed vision of Germany a little bit because I'm in a university town. So it's I'm only getting one segment, but news sources and opinions of experts, even from people that I speak to who are not affiliated with the University of Tübingen, the opinions of experts are respected. Angela Merkel shut down all non-essential businesses 2.5 weeks ago. That includes churches. That's it. Done. And the Germans, by and large, from everything I know, and I'm talking to many people over here about this, they are listening to their leader. They trust their leader because their leader knows what in God's name she's doing. And it's like a different world to me from being back home in America.
But again, I can't help but look at it through the big picture, and I do think it's a problem. I agree with what you just said, Brach, but I'm also reminded through that historical lens of how I usually think about a lot of things is that this too, we've been here before. Not to the same degree in terms of not trusting authority. I think that is new, but we lived through a period where news, the age of yellow journalism, dominated the history of our country for far longer than the golden age of journalism. That in itself was the exception. That golden age where it had professional standards and everybody was in the same consensus that they trusted the same news sources and they were all watching and listening to the same news and reading the same news. That is truly novel. And it only lasted a period of a few decades, really. But it's almost like we've gone back to 1870s, 1880s, the Gilded Age. And
the Hearst versus Pulitzer Wars.
Oh, yeah, the most unscrupulous news reporting that's ever existed. And it was to sell papers. It was a business, and it was nothing but sensationalism. I do think what's novel, though, is the level of conspiracy theories. Although that wasn't unusual back then either. I mean, there was the great period of it, the anarchists, who had their own kind of they were a political movement, but they had their own kinds of paranoid viewpoints on what was happening in global politics. So I don't know. There's nothing new under the sun.
Thank you. We need to.
It doesn't mean it's good, but I do take a weird kind of comfort in knowing that these challenges are not truly new. Humanity has faced them before.
Maybe my Hegelian side is being challenged in all of this because the spirit is not coming to fulfillment here, right? It's not changing for the better.
Well, and that is the debate. I thought history was just one long arc of progress, and it's just going to be beer and Skittles if we can only get to that period, of advancement and development, and we'll reach that promised land of we've managed to evolve our way out of all the previous junk, But it's much more of a cyclical, growth. At least I think of it that way. The cyclical nature of history. Yeah. So. Growth, plateau, decay, rebirth.
I think it's all going to be beer and Skittles might be my new favorite phrase.
I should give credit. That was one of my professors of history. He when he talked about the philosophy of history, it was, what is your basic viewpoint of how history works? It was based on that philosophy. And if you think we're one big arc towards progress and improvement, and you hit that somewhere in the distant future, you'll hit that Star Trek future where everything's beer and Skittles. And that was his go-to phrase for that. So yeah. I still remember.
That's a great one. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So interestingly, Kristen, I also studied history in my undergrad. Never went on after that because I became a theologian for some reason that I'm still trying to figure out why 10 years later. But anyway, My approach was the approach of Heraclitus. You can't put your foot in the same stream twice.
Okay, fair enough.
So I would have said, and note the would have, I would have said history never repeats itself.
Yeah.
And yet now, the things that have been going on, and thank you for reminding me of yellow journalism, by the way. I'm actually beginning to take some comfort myself now. Being reminded of that, I'd forgotten.
Yeah.
And so maybe in fact Heraclitus, or rather my reading of Heraclitus 15 years ago, may have been a bit overstated.
I would say you can't step in the same stream twice, but you can certainly slip on the same rock.
That's one way to parse the metaphor. I mean, there's different. I think thinking of it in terms of themes. You know, you're right in the sense that the exact history is not going to repeat itself, but there's because we're human, and that gets more to the philosophy and theology and anthropology of what does it mean to be human. And the same themes are going to keep coming up again and again and again. And I hate that trite saying that those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. I mean, that's not true. I mean, we're not going to repeat the same things in history, but the same themes keep coming up in kind of a tragic way, you know. And I do think it's funny that this time period is a good example of that, because people keep talking about, I never thought I'd live in a time of pandemic. And it's like, yeah, because we just exited from living memory the last one. We've been blessed in the United States, in North America, for having, it's been over 100 years since our last official pandemic. And so literally it's something nobody has any living memory of how to deal with. But if you actually, I was doing this last night, if you look up the history of epidemics in the world, there's never been a time there wasn't one somewhere. And then of course, massive breakouts of a pandemic that affect, you know, places more or less simultaneously. But it's just interesting that, that kind of historical amnesia of forgetting that this is part of the human experience. Sadly, it's a universal experience. And literally the church has been walking alongside and been, you know, on the front lines of epidemics, pandemics throughout its entire 2,000-year history.
That also brings comfort, I realized something. You know, yeah, I knew a little bit about the influenza epidemic of 1918, but I so stupidly thought it wouldn't happen again.
Well, and we all did. Who thinks that horrible thing is going to happen during our period? And I get that. And I think sometimes this has to do with, so culturally, I'm from the South. My family are Southerners. They're from rural Appalachia. And I think something of value in Southern culture in general is oral history has been much better preserved in that part of the country than I would argue other parts. And there is a real value in having those stories that you tell over and over again. And the same can be true theologically in the church. There's a reason why we repeat our history. It tells us what God has done, who God, not just who God is, but what God has done. And it reminds us of how we got here. And so whether you do that from a theological perspective or from a, you know, in terms of genealogy and your personal family history. And I think the failure to tell those personal impact stories and keep them alive, you know, how did my great grandparent or great great grandparent survive, you know, the flu epidemic? Some people don't pass on those stories, maybe because culturally that it just wasn't a part of their, you know, family. But having those stories alive, I think, also helps us prepare us for the future, and it keeps us grounded and connected and in context, I guess, you know, if that makes any sense. So
context really is key.
It is. It puts things in perspective. Nothing I've said about history is truly comforting, other than it reminds us that this is part of the human experience. People have gone through it before. God steered us through these difficult times before. You know, the Holy Spirit was with our ancestors. So I think reliving those stories, it's been on my mind to go back and read the book of Joel. We always read that section on Ash Wednesday, and most people have not read the book of Joel, and I'll be honest, I've not read it a ton either. But it does deal with a natural disaster. The big hordes of armies aren't literal armies of people. It's the armies of the locusts. They experienced this huge environmental disaster during that period, and all the crops were eaten by this locust disaster. And Joel, the prophet, is literally, writing, preaching, prophesying, praying, trying to work out what does it mean. Mm-hmm. And so, I think making sure we tell the story and keep it alive of where we've been before, and actually verbalize who God is, that God has been with God's people the entire time, walking with us on the journey, steering us through these difficult times. And so this is not truly unique. God has gotten us through these times before. That brings me personal comfort. I don't know if it would help everybody, but I view very much, I'm very attached to salvation history, that view of history of God is constantly working out salvation for God's people through time, and the importance of actually...
Is there a particular theologian you're influenced by with that?
Oh, not that I can name offhand, but I've just always been very attached to that view of why we read and why it's important to read all of Scripture and keep those stories going, and then keep the story going not just at the end of the book of Revelation. Tell the story of the saints of church history for 2,000 years, of the martyrs, the reformers, that literally God has not abandoned us between the year 100 AD and the Reformation, usually how Lutherans view history. So
on my worst days, I'd like to view history like that, but only on my worst days. Tune in, by the way, Kristen, 2 weeks from now. My secondary dissertation supervisor, Professor Volker Lepine, is going to join us, and
we lost you for a second there, Brach.
Yeah, you cut out.
So you... Oh, sorry. A week from Tuesday, my beloved secondary dissertation supervisor, Professor Volker Lepine, will join Peter and I, and he is a Middle Ages and Reformation historian, so you might like that, Kristen.
Oh, I would love that. That's awesome.
Yeah. But you're inspiring us here to take our stories seriously, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have some historian friends who've been urging to actually keep journals, whether it's a blog or something like this, a podcast. It doesn't have to be like you literally with a fountain pen writing onto a piece of paper, but actually keeping.
But I do that too, Kristen.
Well, and that's great. Do that too. But, the importance of keeping these personal records, because I can tell you from the perspective of I've worked, part-time in archives and that kind of thing, is the things of true historical interest usually involve story. Mm-hmm. You are interested in the data. That's super important, and you need to have that. But when you're like in a church archives, I was moved so many times working in a church archives when you actually stumble across like a journal or photographs or, a sermon or things that actually told the story of people in time. So I think actually people should feel encouraged to start keeping those records now. I don't know, maybe they vlog, maybe they do YouTube vlogs, whatever. But making sure that the story will still continue on, so that the next 100 years, if you can think that far ahead, in 100 years, not just historians, but ordinary people will be able to look back and see, how did we get through this time? What really mattered to us? What decisions were we making? And the politics were important, but the ordinary lived experience day to day.
I hate to sound pessimistic, and ironically pessimistic, actually. But some days I wonder if the Earth is even going to be around in 100 years.
Well, that could be true. We're facing huge crises, and we were even before this pandemic. I worry about global warming. I worry about the environment. I worry about wars and all kinds of things, and we should be concerned about that. And who knows, maybe Jesus comes back in the next hour, So.
And this podcast never makes it to publication.
The podcast never, all this hard effort, and we get raptured.
If you want things that'll keep you up at night, I also really like astronomy. And so sometimes I'll think about the fact that a huge gamma ray burst could be shooting across the universe and headed straight towards Earth. And it would literally cook the planet and everything would be destroyed in seconds. You can think of that. So there are no guarantees.
I don't think I need one more reason to be anxious.
Well,
I really don't.
Brach, I'm sorry. I'm all about the bigger picture. Sometimes it's worth thinking about,
Mm-hmm.
Not if it gives you a panic attack, but, there are no guarantees. We're not in control. I preach that all the time when I'm actually in the pulpit preaching. We do have this may devolve into a debate on human free will, but we can make choices, of course, and we can influence things, but we're kidding ourselves if we think we're in control. So
yeah.
Oh, I agree with everything you're saying. It doesn't mean I like it. Doesn't mean I wanted to hear the gospel on our podcast today.
I can tell you right now, like the Nebraska Synod, we have our very own Spirituality Institute. If you'd like to get hooked up with some spiritual practices, it might help you feel more centered.
I'm a Lutheran. We do spiritual practices.
Yeah, we do.
We do some centering prayer.
I'm just teasing. Before I moved to Germany, I was a postulant for too brief of a time with the Order of Lutheran Franciscans, and the only reason I didn't go through with it is because I ended up remaining in Germany. Originally, I planned to come home in 4 months and return to LSTC, where I was doing a PhD, but the Holy Spirit had other plans, and so here I am. I loved that about the Lutheran Franciscans, and actually, I didn't say this. I don't know what they would think. I haven't talked to them. They're lovely people, by the way, but I haven't talked to anybody about this. But my support of open communion open communion, but that's a different argument, a virtual communion in certain circumstances had to do with that. I know the Lutheran Franciscans considered themselves to be in communion for prayer when they pray the office virtually. Now, I never spoke with them about virtual communion, and that was just never a topic. But I take my own openness to that idea as it sort of shifted in me. That came from my time with the Lutheran Franciscans and their notion of a monastery without walls.
Yeah.
I thought that was very moving. And the only reason that I didn't keep that up in Germany even was because I just couldn't do all the postulant work. So I think that's very fascinating, the potentiality of digital daily prayer and worship and hymn singing, all of that. And yet I still didn't want to hear the gospel today, Kristen.
You're welcome. Sorry. I'm not in the parish anymore. I couldn't help myself.
Right.
So I just had to preach to y'all.
I mean, are you sure you didn't study with Gerhard Ferde? I mean,
no. This is a tangent. This is a funny thing. Being out in the Midwest, I'm like discovering Midwest Lutheranism for the very first time. I'm like, oh, this exists, because I'm such an East Coast Lutheran in terms of. So I'm also a genealogy nerd. So my family is so Lutheran, I joke. I can trace it all the way back to the first German Lutherans who came over to Philadelphia in like 1730, and were part of the early Muhlenberg Lutheran churches. So
he's my guy. I like Muhlenberg, but anyway.
Right. So, and in fact, my mom is a Lutheran pastor, and her church in rural Virginia is 260 years old this year.
Wow.
So for me, my experience of Lutheranism has been very much that very old East Coast Lutheranism. And then I come out here and I'm like, oh, there's like Scandinavian Lutherans, and what's up with that? Like, they got their own theologians. What do they have to say? What's up with these weird foods, and why they eat Jell-O so much? I don't know. I'm sorry, at Southern Lutheran gatherings, we eat Southern food, fried chicken.
Yes. Oh, do you know how much I miss fried chicken in Germany, Kristen?
I bet you do.
Can I just and a greasy fried chicken and a greasy hamburger? Oh my goodness. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
So, anyways, I'm kind of sadly still kind of ignorant of so many of the big titans and figureheads of the Midwest Lutheranism. Mm-hmm. It just wasn't something that I spent any time reading up on, and it's like I'm experiencing it for the first time. Like, oh, I guess the Swedes and the Norwegians were doing stuff out here. Sure.
And the ironic part is, I think the majority of the ELCA is actually Scandinavian by history, isn't it?
That could be true, but there's an awful lot of Germans. The country in terms of the history of our country. There was continuous waves of German immigrants over the course of our entire history.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, and I'm a German Lutheran by both intellectual, theological persuasion and actually ancestry. I found some, at least with the same last name, so I presume there's some kind of ancestry. German Lutherans in the little town of Plön up by Wittenberg, which is kind of fun to realize, but my experience of the ELCA was the German Lutherans were in the minority.
That could be true. It could be. I'll say this for my home synod of Virginia. Those little old Lutheran churches are small.
Mm-hmm.
They're not the big Lutheran churches that you would see that really kind of flourished later in
Mm-hmm.
Wisconsin, Minnesota. So that makes sense. They're just extremely old, and they're still hanging on, and they won't close because they're old. You can't close a church that's 260 years old. And what's so funny is my mom's church has there's two cemeteries. There's the old cemetery, quote unquote, and the new cemetery, quote unquote. And the new cemetery was built in I'm guessing I think it's 1840 or 1850.
Right.
And then the old cemetery is colonial, and there's no grave markers left because they all had wooden headstones back then.
Right.
And that was from 1740, 1750. So that's an old cemetery, and then the new cemetery is 1840.
Wow.
So.
And the funny thing is, us as Americans, we go 1740. Wow, that's old. Meanwhile, my German friends are going, oh, that's so new.
Yeah, exactly. It's all relative.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the new cemetery in Germany.
Right. Kristen, the University of Tübingen was founded by Duke Eberhard the Bearded, which is just an awesome name.
Yes.
Duke Eberhard the Bearded in 1477.
Yep. Wow. Yep.
And
that's not even that old.
Well, right. It's probably the midpoint in terms of, there are universities that are maybe 200-300 years older than Tübingen, but and I just get overwhelmed. I'm like, oh my God, 1477. And because this town was not destroyed during the war, it's one of the true medieval so-called university towns still standing.
They still have that city plan as it was originally conceived.
Yes, I mean there were additions to the buildings, which is a little sad. In the Brach era, things were redone and so forth. But you have essentially in the Altstadt here, you have. It's preserved, and it's really, really fascinating. I don't know all the cobble streets and all that, and then of course, you go to the north of the town, or you go, I guess, south. My directional sense is bad, but I guess if you go north and south of the Altstadt, you have, everything's modern and all of that. But
sure.
It's a little bit, it's overwhelming to me.
And then, as much as I love the European history, which I'm crazy about, don't get me wrong, I also am very aware. So I'm a Spanish speaker. I'm also aware that these conversations about the historic ethnicity of Lutheranism are by and large esoteric and have been for a while.
Yes.
And one of our global mission partners for the Nebraska Synod is the Northern Diocese of Tanzania, where literally they're on track. Wow. Tanzania is on track to have more Lutherans than Germany.
Amen.
Wow.
They're headed. They have to keep adding dioceses to Tanzania because they keep bursting at the seams in terms of adding new people. Yeah. So it's just bonkers.
My slightly heretical prediction is, I think in 50 years, when people want to study theology as an academic discipline, they're not going to go to Yale and Tübingen and Oxford and Louvain and all these places. They're going to go somewhere in the global south.
Oh, absolutely. And we've been looking at it as a synod, and I know other bishops and synods have been looking at it. The big kind of report is the globe. Let me think about it so I get this correct. The historic center of Christianity has been tracked for 2,000 years, and for the first time, it's moving out of Europe since the beginning. Yep. I mean, the original historic center, of course, was kind of modern day Syria, and then of course, the large Christian communities in Africa shrunk with the spread of Islam. And but now it's drifting and it's headed for Africa again. So the actual global center of Christianity is if it's not there already, it's headed to Africa. So
wow.
Yeah,
there's a book on this in terms of what that means for specifically Lutheran theology. My late teacher Vitor Vestella, his last book, Transfiguring Luther, the Planetary Promise of Luther's Theology.
Wow.
And that book really lays out what a Lutheran theology might look like as it shifts from the North Atlantic to the global South.
Sure.
It's really a great book. So I just plugged that on here. It's a hard book as well, but maybe skip his essay on language because I'm still not sure I understand it. But otherwise, it's a wonderful book.
Well, and to circle back to Nebraska, the state where I am, my adopted home. Something I'm very proud of is that in 2016, Nebraska settled more refugees per capita than any other state.
Wow.
And that's through Lutheran Family Services and Catholic Refugee Service,
cool.
Both extremely active.
Yeah.
And we have this really diverse immigrant community here. And we have growing churches of South Sudanese Lutherans. So we have a really large relatively large South Sudanese population living in Omaha and Lincoln. So, and several Lutheran churches made of South Sudanese.
Yes. Well, on that hopeful note, we should wrap it up.
Great. We covered a lot of ground.
We did. I love it.
Well, then, and Kristen, we want to thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely.
It's a pleasure.
Yes, for this wide-ranging discussion. Again, everything discussed here is the personal opinion of the discussers.
Right.
And not of the synods and or universities that they may be connected to in some way. And until next time, I'm Brach Jennings.
And I'm Peter Clark.
And this is your friendly neighborhood Lutheran theology podcast, Stumbling Block.
Stumbling Block is a production of Silver Turkey Studios. Our Patreon producer is Ben Dittman, our executive producer is Peter Clark, and our executive director is Brach Jennings. Our theme music is by Mirrors for Windows, and we are hosted by Podbean. We can be reached by email at stumblingblockpodcast@gmail.com. Please consider supporting us at patreon.com/stumblingblock. And as always, thank you for listening.